Once upon a time, in a sprawling mansion nestled deep in the heart of an isolated forest, there lived a seemingly happy family of four. John, a diligent father, embarked on his daily journey to his 9-to-5 job in the bustling city. Sarah, the elder daughter, and Emily, the younger, set off to school, their laughter echoing through the grand hallways of their opulent residence. Their mother, Elizabeth, stayed behind, her laptop glowing with a remote job that enabled her to work from the comfort of their luxurious home. The house itself was a breathtaking spectacle of architectural prowess, but it held a dark and unsettling history. It was an imposing structure, adorned with towering spires and glistening stained glass windows that cast eerie, ever-changing shadows. Built over a century ago, it had seen countless families come and go, but none of them ever stayed for long. Elizabeth, despite the family's wealth and grandeur, couldn't help but feel a shiver crawl down her spine every time she wandered the endless corridors, each one lined with fading family portraits, where the stern faces of the past peered down at her with judgmental eyes. One cold, overcast morning, as Emily and Sarah rushed off to school, Elizabeth settled into her home office. The mansion was ominously quiet, the silence broken only by the distant sound of crows cawing in the woods. The isolation of the forest had always unnerved her, but today that discomfort seemed to have taken on a new level of unease. As the day progressed, Elizabeth's remote work kept her occupied, but the sense of being alone in the vast mansion never truly left her. She couldn't help but feel a growing paranoia, as if unseen eyes were watching her every move. The mansion seemed to breathe with its own sinister life, the walls whispering secrets she couldn't decipher. By mid-afternoon, a fierce storm began to brew, casting an eerie darkness over the house. Thunder rumbled ominously, and the wind howled through the trees like the anguished cries of lost souls. Elizabeth's unease intensified, and she decided to explore the house in an attempt to quell her growing apprehension. She ventured into the mansion's dimly lit corridors, where the portraits of long-dead ancestors seemed to shift, their eyes following her every step. The unsettling feeling of being watched and the inexplicable whispers grew louder as she descended deeper into the house. The very walls appeared to groan with an oppressive weight, and her breath quickened. Finally, she entered a forgotten wing of the mansion, a place that was almost abandoned and hadn't seen the light of day for decades. Here, the air was damp, and the shadows clung to the walls like malevolent spirits. As she stepped further into the dark hallway, her footsteps echoed eerily, as if she were disturbing a long-held silence. Elizabeth's heart raced as she approached an ornate, heavy wooden door that seemed out of place in the decrepit hallway. Her trembling hand turned the cold brass doorknob, and the door creaked open to reveal a hidden chamber. Inside, she found a room filled with strange and grotesque artifacts. Dolls with hollow, glassy eyes leered at her from dusty shelves, and faded, cryptic symbols were etched into the walls. In the center of the room, an old, cracked mirror stood, its surface tarnished with age. As Elizabeth gazed into the mirror, her reflection began to warp and contort, taking on an unsettling, malevolent quality. She tried to step back, but an invisible force held her in place, her image in the mirror seeming to draw her in. The mirror revealed nightmarish scenes of the past, of families who had once lived in this cursed mansion. Their agonized faces, twisted by fear and despair, haunted her. She saw her own husband and daughters, locked in the mansion's malevolent embrace, their eyes filled with tears and terror. Terrified and trapped, Elizabeth tried to tear herself away from the mirror, but it refused to release her. In the glass, her reflection began to change, morphing into a grotesque, nightmarish version of herself, with hollow eyes and a sinister smile. Meanwhile, in the city, John felt an inexplicable dread wash over him as he left work early, overcome by an urgent, unsettling feeling. He raced back to the mansion, his heart heavy with foreboding. Back at the mansion, Elizabeth's reflection reached out from the mirror, its long, bony fingers wrapping around her throat. She gasped for air as her vision faded to black. In that eerie, hidden room, her fate was sealed, and she joined the countless lost souls trapped within the mansion's dark history. As John arrived home, he was met with a chilling silence. His calls for his wife and daughters went unanswered. The grand, eerie mansion stood as it always had, but now it was empty, save for the dark secrets that whispered through its cursed halls. John's life was forever marked by the horror that had taken hold of his family, and the mansion's hunger for more victims continued to grow, its grim history repeating itself over and over again. In a quiet, secluded town nestled deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, there stood an old, dilapidated house that had been abandoned for years. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about the dwelling, rumors of strange occurrences and ghostly apparitions surrounding it. Jude and Blessin, two childhood friends, had heard the tales, but dismissed them as mere superstition. Little did they know, their lives were about to take a terrifying turn that fateful night. Jude had always been the more adventurous of the two, often convincing the timid Blessin to accompany him on his escapades. On that chilly autumn evening, Blessin had fallen ill with a fever. Jude, concerned for his friend's well-being, decided to make a late-night run to the nearest pharmacy, which was a good distance away. The clock chimed 10 as Jude left Blessin in the dimly lit living room, wrapped in blankets and shivering from the fever. Jude promised he would be back as quickly as possible, and he set out on the dark, winding road that led to the town's only pharmacy. The moonlight cast eerie shadows on the gnarled trees, and the night seemed unusually quiet. Jude's unease grew as he ventured further from the safety of the town's warm glow. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, but he attributed it to the tales of the abandoned house that had haunted his childhood. Meanwhile, back at the house, Blessin lay weak and delirious, occasionally muttering to himself. The flickering candlelight added to the eerie atmosphere. The sounds of the forest outside were only amplified in the silence. The wind rustled through the trees, creating ghostly whispers that sent shivers down Blessin's spine. As the minutes turned into hours, Jude finally reached the pharmacy, collected the necessary medications, and made his way back towards the house. But the path seemed unfamiliar, the woods closing in around him like a living, breathing entity. His flashlight cast eerie beams into the inky darkness, revealing the twisted forms of trees that seemed to reach out for him. As he drew closer to the house, a chilling sight awaited him. The flickering candlelight in the window was no longer visible. Instead, the house stood in complete darkness. Jude's heart raced as he approached the front door and pushed it open, calling out for Blessin. Inside, the house was colder than before, and an unsettling silence hung in the air. Jude ventured further into the living room and felt a growing dread as he discovered it empty. The blankets that had cocooned Blessin were now strewn across the floor, and the candle had burnt out. Panic surged through Jude's veins as he called out for his friend. He ascended the creaking stairs, each step echoing through the quiet house. As he reached the top, the sound of faint whispers grew louder. The voices seemed to come from the far end of the hall. Jude followed the eerie murmurs, passing by room after room, until he reached the last door. With trembling hands, he pushed it open and found himself in a room filled with old, dusty toys, and on the floor, Blessin sat, his fevered eyes wide and vacant. He mumbled incoherent words, seemingly in a trance. Jude rushed to Blessin's side, shaking him and trying to snap him out of it. But the whispers in the room intensified, and the toys seemed to come to life, their shadows dancing on the walls. The voices in the room turned sinister, their tone filled with malice, and they seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. In sheer terror, Jude realized that the room was a portal to some malevolent dimension. Desperation coursed through him as he tried to pull Blessin away from the room, but his friend resisted, still entranced by the haunting whispers. The house seemed to come alive, its walls groaning and shifting, as if it were trying to keep Blessin within its grasp. Jude's frantic efforts to save his friend only seemed to exacerbate the house's wrath. He could feel unseen hands pulling at him, trying to drag him into the darkness of that accursed room. With one final, Herculean effort, Jude managed to yank Blessin out of the room, breaking the sinister connection. They tumbled down the stairs, and the house's malevolent presence seemed to recede. They fled into the woods, not daring to look back. The horrors they had encountered in that house haunted their dreams for years to come. The stories of the house and its ghastly whispers had not been mere superstition, but a chilling reality. Jude and Blesson vowed never to return to that forsaken place, forever marked by the horrifying night when they had been home alone, at the mercy of an unspeakable evil that lurked within the shadows of the abandoned house in the Appalachian Mountains. Hope and Sophia were inseparable, the closest of friends. They shared secrets, dreams, and even the tiniest of joys. But as it often happens, misunderstandings can rip apart the strongest of bonds. One summer evening, an innocent mistake escalated into a bitter fight. Sophia, hurt and angered, stormed out of the house they'd spent so many memorable hours in. Hope stood alone in the dimming light, her heart heavy with the weight of their fight. The clock ticked on, and the silence in the house grew thicker with each passing moment. Hope thought about reaching out to Sophia, but her pride held her back. She decided to wait, believing that Sophia would return once her anger had subsided. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows grew longer, and the room felt colder. Hope's unease intensified. She tried to keep herself busy, but her heart was a pendulum swinging between regret and hope. Night fell, bringing with it an eerie silence. The house seemed to groan with age, its creaks and whispers echoing through the darkened hallways. Hope's unease turned into dread, and she realized she was truly alone. She closed all the curtains, leaving only a small lamp on in the corner. The warm light flickered, casting haunting shadows that danced on the walls. Hope's mind played tricks on her. Every small sound in the house seemed magnified, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She locked herself in her bedroom, the only sanctuary she could find. The night wore on, and Hope's imagination ran wild. She heard footsteps in the hallway, soft voices whispering and doors creaking open. She knew she was alone, but her mind refused to believe it. At one point, she convinced herself that she saw Sophia's silhouette in the corner of the room, but when she turned on the light, there was nothing there. The air grew icy, and Hope's breath formed a visible mist. As the hours passed, Hope's fear gave way to exhaustion. She thought that sleep might be her only escape from the night's torment. But when she closed her eyes, her dreams were just as haunting as the reality around her. She dreamt of Sophia, her friend's face twisted in anger and despair. Sophia's ghostly figure whispered words of blame and sorrow. Hope's screams went unheard as she was dragged into a dark abyss. Morning finally arrived, and the sun's first rays chased away the horrors of the night. Hope's heart ached as the realization sunk in. Sophia never returned. She was left alone to face the night's terrors, both real and imagined. Years passed, and Hope never recovered from that harrowing night. The house, once a place of joy and laughter, became a prison of darkness and despair. She never forgave herself for not reconciling with Sophia, for letting her leave in anger. To this day, Hope still hears the faint echoes of that fateful night, the footsteps in the dark, the whispers in the shadows, and the phantom presence of her friend. The memory of that lonely night haunts her, a chilling reminder of the price one can pay for the pride that keeps loved ones apart.